Hello everyone, God bless, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Zachary Strong, and I am a Noahide, which means I'm a non-Jew who follows the law of Moses, and I'm also a physicist and a biblical scholar. And today we're going to be bringing all of those different things together in an exploration of what the Torah means when it says living God. So, at various points throughout the Torah and the prophets, God is referred to as a living God. And for some reason, I started wondering, like, what does that actually mean? Okay, what does it actually mean when we refer to God as a living God? And so I did a whole bunch of Googling and looked online at Jewish sources, couldn't find anything. Asked a couple of rabbis I know about the topic, and they were kind of like, we don't know. So it turns out that, as far as I know, nobody has really taken a dive into this area of Torah, which is what it means when we refer to God as a living God. And then for a few months I was thinking about this and looking up different sources, both in science and Torah. And I think I might have some answers, which I'm going to be sharing in this video. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to start out by looking at the biblical references. And then I'm going to dive into some scientific references, specifically around physics and the physics of life. And then we're going to bring it all together and we're going to talk about Satan, sin, entropy, a concept I've developed known as social entropy, and what I think the unifying principle of biblical law is, which is life. And we're also going to relate that to God's commandment to Abram to go to yourself in Genesis chapter 12. And so what I hope to show in this video is that a certain equation in thermodynamics illustrates and brings together many different aspects of biblical law, and kind of the entire idea of the Torah, which is life. Okay, and along the way we're going to understand at a very deep level what the Torah and prophets mean when they say living God. Okay, so let's get started. We'll start out with the biblical references. So in Deuteronomy chapter 5 verse 26, Moses says to Israel, "For who is there of all flesh who heard the voice of the living God speaking from the midst of the fire as we have and lived?" In Jeremiah chapter 10, it says, "The Lord God is true. He is a living God and the King of the world. From his anger the earth quakes, and the nations cannot contain his fury." And also in Proverbs chapter 3, it refers to the Torah as a tree of life for those who grasp it. And so what we have here is a very big emphasis on life and living, and an association with God and life. Okay, living God. Okay, so for me, as I mentioned, I was thinking, like, what does this actually mean? Okay, what does this actually mean? And I've searched far and wide for some answers, but couldn't really find any. So I've had to start developing some of my own. And for me as a physicist, I started wondering about the physics of life. Okay, and my thinking was, if I can understand what life is from a scientific viewpoint, maybe that will give me some insight into what we mean by living God and what we mean by the Torah being a tree of life. Okay, and so that brings us to the scientific references. So first we're going to have to talk about entropy. Now, entropy is a scientific concept that measures the amount of disorder, randomness, or uncertainty within a system. It's also a measure of energy unavailable for doing useful work. So on the screen, I've got a diagram that shows high entropy versus low entropy. So on the left-hand side, you have a whole bunch of stuff kind of randomly scattered. That is high entropy. And then on the right-hand side, you have all of those things put together into a single item, okay, which is low entropy. They are ordered, they're arranged, okay, and that's entropy. Now, something related to entropy is a certain equation that you'll know if you've studied thermodynamics, and that's known as the Gibbs free energy equation. Now, we're going to return to this equation later on, and I'll explain it more in depth. But basically, the Gibbs free energy equation is used to determine if a chemical reaction or reaction is going to be spontaneous. And in this equation, we have the available energy to do work, the total energy, and the entropy. Okay, and so essentially what you're doing is you're taking the total energy, you're subtracting the entropy, and that gives you the useful available energy. Okay, and so this is just an illustration, really, of entropy is energy that is not useful for anything. You can't harness it, whatever. It's kind of like waste energy. Okay, so we're going to return to this equation later on, especially when we talk about Satan. Okay, so entropy, disorder, randomness, waste, chaos, and so on. That's entropy. Now, life is very, very different. Okay, life is quite different from entropy because, like I woke up today and neither of my hands disintegrated. Okay, like my hands didn't just randomly disintegrate. Like you wake up every day and ideally your body is working much the same way as it always has. And yes, as you get older, you can get sick and so on, but generally your body as a system maintains its own order. Okay? And interestingly, life is characterized by physicists as a biological process that decreases local entropy. Okay, and so this is very interesting because entropy is disorder and randomness and chaos. But life is a process that resists that, at least on a local level. Okay, so plants growing, your body maintaining itself and naturally recovering from things. These are processes that resist entropy. Okay, life is known as neg-entropic, which means it's resisting entropy. Okay, now interestingly, in order for your body or plants or anything to reduce local entropy, it has to increase entropy elsewhere. Okay, so let's say you're eating a cheeseburger. Okay, your body gets energy from the cheeseburger, which it then uses in its natural processes to resist entropy within the body. However, there's fuel burned to cook the cheeseburger. You burned fuel to transport everything to the restaurant. There's packaging and other garbage and other waste. So even though entropy is being decreased on a local level, you're creating entropy elsewhere. Okay? And so life, kind of pulls in all of these things, uses them in a process, and decreases entropy. Okay? So that got me thinking, okay, life resists entropy. And maybe this is somehow related to the concept of a living God. Okay? Now what we're going to do is we're going to dive a layer deeper, and we're going to look beyond the body, and we're going to also look at the brain right now. Now, as you might imagine, the brain is primarily responsible for processing information. Okay, it's kind of like the central computing unit of the body. Okay, and yes, it sends out orders to the body so you can move your limbs and stuff, but really what the brain is doing is taking in information from your senses, processing it, and then doing things with that information. And the really, really cool thing is that this is also related to entropy. So in 1948, some scientists at Bell Labs developed a mathematical theory of communication, which is a book on the physics of information transfer. And they related information to entropy through the concept of surprise. So essentially, if something is surprising, it's entropic, okay? Because entropy is random, disorder, chaos, right? And chaos and surprise are, as you might imagine, quite related. The more chaotic something is, the more surprising something is, and therefore the more information it contains. So based on this work, a neuroscientist named Carl Friston developed something known as the free energy principle. And essentially what he did when he analyzed the brain and how it worked is he realized that the brain works to minimize surprise from the senses. Okay? And the mathematics of how this all works is very, very similar to the Gibbs free energy equation, which you can see on the screen. Okay? And so essentially, your brain doesn't like being surprised. Okay? Usually because surprises are often bad. Okay? Like if you're walking through the forest and a jaguar jumps out at you, that's a surprise. That's not very good. Okay? It means when your brain is surprised, it means that you don't necessarily know what's going on. Okay? Which means possibility for danger. And so your brain is wired to minimize surprise. Now, in his main paper, which I've linked to in the description, Carl Friston observed that the brain's attempts to minimize surprise also resists entropy, okay, at least on a local level, because entropy is surprise, okay, and your brain doesn't like being surprised, and so it tries to reduce its own levels of surprise. So just in the same way that your body maintains all of its systems and reduces entropy on a local level, your brain is doing the same thing, just with information. Okay, so both your body and your mind are reducing entropy. They are resisting disorder, resisting chaos. Okay, you could say that they are driven to create order. They're driven to create order. Okay, your body wants to remain ordered, your mind wants to remain ordered. Okay, and therefore they must resist entropy and reduce chaos and surprise and disorder. Okay, so those are the scientific references that I was going to share. So after I was reading about all of this and thinking about all of this, I started to think, how could this be related to the Torah? How could this be related to the concept of a living God? Okay, and this is where we're going to get into the unification of all of these ideas. Okay, so if life means decreasing entropy and death means increasing entropy, okay, what could this mean? What could this mean? Okay, the first thing that we're going to do is look at Satan, sin, and entropy. And it turns out that some references to Satan and entropy exist within Jewish literature. So in Judaism, Satan refers to the Yetzer Hara, or evil inclination, which is a force within humans that tempts them to sin, and is also a divine accuser who tests faith but operates under God's will. And we find this in Job chapter 1, when the Satan comes to God's heavenly court, and Satan and God talk about what he's up to, and they single out Job for some tests and some hardship. Okay, now in the Malbim's commentary on the book of Job, he says that the Satan's powers of destruction and disintegration are not found in heaven, but rather are eternally bonded to physical matter. The Satan's answer to God implies that these powers occur as part of the natural ongoing process of disintegration inherent in all matter. Okay, what the Malbim is talking about here is entropy. Okay, and what he's doing is saying the Satan is the angel responsible for entropy. All entropy. Okay? The Satan is responsible for your car rusting. Okay? The Satan is responsible for you getting sick. The Satan is responsible for buildings crumbling and needing to be maintained. Okay? The Satan is responsible for the food in your fridge, going bad. Okay? The Satan is responsible for all entropy. Which is interesting because remember, your body and your mind want to resist entropy. They want to resist the Satan. Okay, so that's quite interesting. Rabbi Mendel Kessin has said the following. God took the flow of energy, the divine energy that sustains the Satan, and redistributed it. God takes the edge of the cable connected to the Satan and connects it to man. Now all mankind has a cable that comes down through which the divine energy flows. One part goes to mankind and the other part goes directly to the Satan. Therefore, it comes out that they're both vying for the same energy. They both need it to exist. If mankind does the will of God, the flow goes to him and he exists continuously and flourishes tremendously. What happens to the Satan? The energy goes to man and not to the Satan. The Satan grows weak. The whole side of evil grows weak and he begins to falter, and eventually, if all mankind takes away the energy of the Satan, then he dies. He's expelled from human reality, from the entire physical universe. That's how God does it, since he's part of you and you're bringing down the energy. But what happens if mankind sins? The energy that mankind was supposed to have gotten then goes to the Satan. Uh-oh, if it goes to the Satan, mankind begins to diminish and to falter. And so what Rabbi Mendel Kessin and the Kabbalists are saying is that when we sin, we give energy to the Satan. Okay? When we sin, we give energy to entropy, is essentially what he's saying. Okay? So sin and entropy seem to be related. Okay? Sin is doing something that God doesn't want, which is therefore creating some kind of chaos, right? Because entropy is chaos. So if you're doing what God wants, you're creating order. Okay, if you sin, you're creating disorder or chaos, and that energy goes to the Satan. And so essentially, to use a bit of a metaphor, the Satan is almost like a form of energy vampire. The Satan is almost like a form of energy vampire. And he's tempting us to sin, okay, with, the evil inclination. He's tempting us because he needs our energy. Okay, he needs us to sin so he can stay alive. Okay? However, if we follow the commandments and we behave the way we're supposed to behave, we don't give the Satan any energy. Therefore, he withers and dies. Okay? Now, I thought that was really interesting. Okay, now, I think I figured this out a couple of years ago, but I never really connected everything until this year. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to return to the Gibbs free energy equation. So the way the Gibbs free energy equation is typically stated is delta G, the change in available energy to do work, is equal to delta H, which is the total energy of the system, minus delta S, which is the entropy. Okay. Now, the cool thing about mathematical equations is you can rearrange the terms of the equation. And all we need to do is take the negative delta S and move it over to the left-hand side. Okay, and what do we get? Total energy is equal to useful energy plus entropy. Or total energy is equal to commandments plus sins. Total energy is equal to order plus chaos. Okay, and this is astounding. When I rearranged this equation and looked at it from the perspective of sin, commandments, Satan, entropy, all of it, when I rearranged this equation and I saw this, I was absolutely astounded. Okay? Because essentially, let's say God gives you 10 units of energy a day. Okay? Let's say God gives you 10 units of energy a day. Okay? you can choose to put those 10 units of energy into commandments, or you can choose to put them into sins. Okay? Total energy is equal to commandments plus sins. It's got to go somewhere. It's got to go somewhere, right? And so if you have 10 units of energy coming to you a day, like spiritual energy, okay, and you spend 8 of those on sins, okay, that's putting it on the entropy part of the equation, which gives the Satan power. Okay? But if you choose to follow the commandments and you put all 10 units of energy into the commandments, the Satan gets nothing. And you're creating order within the universe. Okay? So that's really exciting, because remember, death, okay, death, which is the opposite of life, is related to entropy. Okay? When you get older, okay, heaven forbid you get sick, maybe you get some kind of a disease, or heaven forbid you get a heart attack or something like that. Okay? That's entropy at work. That's entropy at work. And that's related to death. And of course, when someone dies, their body decomposes. Okay, their body loses the life force that keeps it together, and it all just kind of decomposes and disintegrates. Okay, so entropy is related to death, and it would seem, therefore, that the commandments are related to life, okay, and order. Okay. Now, what we're going to do, is cover a topic that I've developed called social entropy. Okay, and I haven't really seen too many people talking about this quite in this way, but I think it's very, very important when it comes to biblical thought. So, in the same way that chaos and order exist in the natural world, okay, in nature, okay, chaos and order exist in nature, your bodies and your minds also deal with chaos and order, okay, in terms of resisting entropy and so on. The same things seem to be at work in human societies, okay? So in social environments, a human being doing something troublesome or unexpected creates surprise for everyone else, okay, which is a form of entropy, okay? So let's say, for example, you're walking down a crowded street, and out of nowhere you just yell and scream at the top of your lungs. Okay? Everyone around you is going to be very, very surprised. Okay? They're going to be very surprised. That's entropy. Okay? In a social context. Okay? The way that we behave in social groups either adds chaos to the social group, or it reinforces the order of the social group. Okay? Therefore, a chaotic or disordered society contains a lot of entropy, and a harmonious or well-ordered society contains less entropy in a social sense. Okay? And the practical understanding of this is, if a social group has a lot of conflict, disorder, or confusion, members of that group have to process more information in order to function socially. Okay? So let's say you live in maybe not so great of a neighborhood. Maybe there's pickpockets or gangs or something. When you leave your house, you're going to have to be scanning the environment. You're going to have to be maintaining situational awareness. You're going to have to be processing information just to stay safe. Just to stay safe. Okay, it creates a lot of mental work, okay, to exist in those kind of environments. Okay, where like on the other hand, let's say you live in a nicer neighborhood, there's no crime, whatever. You know, if your kid comes to you and says, "Hey, can I go to the park?" It's like, "Oh yeah, off you go do your thing. We don't have to worry about, like, you know, criminals or people abducting you or whatever." Okay? And likewise, let's say you're doing business as a business person, right? A big part of business right now is contracts. Okay, and contracts are good in a lot of ways, but the legal stuff can be a bit excessive sometimes, and that's because of a lack of trust. Okay, it's because of a lack of trust. Contracts and so on really only exist as risk mitigation mechanisms. Okay? Because if you trust somebody, okay, and both of you are trustworthy, you can do a deal on a handshake. You don't necessarily need a contract. Okay? That's low entropy. Doing business in a handshake. Okay? High entropy is bringing in your lawyers, they bring in their lawyers, everyone makes a contract, you haggle over the fine print of the contract, right? That's like a lot of energy that is otherwise wasted when if you are both trustworthy, you can just do a deal on a handshake. Okay? Now, one example that I have of social entropy is actually something that happened in my neighborhood several years ago. So I happen to live in a nice neighborhood, and there's a lot of different shops on a street near me. Okay, it's like one of the shopping centers of the city or whatever. So one evening, a bunch of anarchists got together, and they lit off fireworks and marched down the street and smashed up everything they could. Okay, it was completely random. It was completely random. There wasn't anything that even provoked it. I think they just got together one day and they were like, yeah, let's smash up this street. We're going to show them whatever, right? So obviously this was very, very surprising. There was a big reaction from obviously everyone in the city. You know, people got arrested, blah, blah, blah. That's an example of social entropy. Okay? Because a lot of people were in the neighborhood were then wondering, like, are we safe? Is this going to happen again? Who were these people? We need to catch them so they don't do it again. Blah, blah, blah. It created a whole bunch of entropy. Okay. Now, just as a quick funny aside, a lot of the shops on this particular street are independently owned. They're small businesses run by like regular people. Okay. The anarchists smashed up all of those shops. Okay. But there is also a Starbucks on this street, which is a corporate thing, right? They didn't smash up the corporate. They didn't smash up the Starbucks, but they smashed up all the small businesses. It makes literally no sense. If you're an anarchist who wants to take a stand against the system, why are you targeting small businesses? Why aren't you targeting the corporations? Makes no sense to me. But chaos is as chaos does, I suppose. Now, another example of social entropy is tyranny. Tyranny. If somebody gets into a position of power and they start forcing everyone else to live a certain way or do certain things, it makes everybody at the bottom unhappy. It makes everyone at the bottom unhappy. Okay? And, you know, another example from Canada is the trucker protest that happened. Okay? Certain policies were passed in the country. Truckers felt unfairly targeted by this and they formed a convoy and protested and so on. Okay? So that created a lot of chaos in the country. Okay? It created a lot of chaos. And the reason was, you know, the declarations and edicts of the government were extremely unpalatable to the people actually affected by them. Okay? So tyranny also creates entropy. And if you are a tyrant, you have to spend a tremendous amount of energy and resources in order to maintain power and to force everyone to do what you want them to do. And perhaps the best example of this is the number of gulags, or forced labor prisons, that existed in the Soviet Union, okay, before it fell in 1989. This is a map of all of the different forced labor camps that existed, okay? Basically, if you said anything bad about the Soviet regime, they basically came to your house, dragged you to one of these gulags, okay? Think of the amount of energy that has to be spent managing this whole system and enforcing the whole system. Okay, it's a tremendous amount of energy. Okay, and all of it is basically wasteful because all of the energy and time that could have been spent on this, that was spent on this kind of thing, could have been spent on improving everyone's quality of life rather than shipping them off to the gulags. Okay? Huge waste. Huge waste. But that's another example of social entropy. It can come from the bottom up in terms of people just being chaotic, okay, like the anarchists in my neighborhood, or it can come from the top down in the form of tyranny. Either way, it creates disorder, disharmony, disunity, and waste, okay? So when it comes to this whole concept of social entropy, the more entropy a person or group creates within their social environment, the more work must be done by everyone to keep the social environment cohesive. And at some point, a limit is reached where the social group will rebel against tyranny or crumble under its own chaos. Okay? The biological term for this is carrying capacity. Okay, every society, every social group has a carrying capacity, and if too much social entropy exists, it crumbles or disintegrates. Okay? And, to bring it back to the Soviet Union, in 1989, people finally got fed up. They tore down the Berlin Wall. They overthrew the Soviet regime. And, we entered kind of our current geopolitical era. Okay, this was the end of a geopolitical era. Okay, so at the moment, I've covered a bunch of things that seem somewhat unrelated. Okay, we've talked about the concept of a living God and the Torah being a tree of life. We've looked at entropy and its relationship to life in terms of life resisting entropy. We've talked a little bit about the spirituality of entropy in terms of it being related to sin. Okay, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to bring this all together and show you what I think the unifying principle of the Torah might be. Okay, so if you remember earlier on in the video, I talked about the Gibbs free energy equation. And when we rearrange the equation, we get total energy equals useful energy plus entropy. Total energy equals commandments plus sins. Total energy equals order plus chaos. Okay, now with that in mind, we can start examining the statements of the sages, okay, and things in the Torah and prophets and writings. We can start looking at them through this lens, okay, and we can actually gain a whole bunch from it. So one example of this is Hillel, okay, something that the sage Hillel said. So the Talmud tells the story of a Gentile who came to Shammai requesting a conversion to Judaism. He asked to be taught the entire Torah while standing on one foot. Shammai had no patience for the ridiculous and disrespectful request and chased him out of the study hall. Undaunted, the fellow then proceeded to visit Shammai's colleague, Hillel, with the same request. Hillel stood on one foot and instructed him. Whatever is hateful and distasteful to you, do not do to your fellow man. This is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Go learn. Okay? From the perspective of physics, from the perspective of the equation that I just showed you, this statement makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. What Hillel is saying is, do not create entropy, and especially social entropy. Do not create social entropy, okay? Because if it's hateful and distasteful to you, and it's hateful and distasteful to other people, and you do it, you're creating social entropy. Do not do that. That is the entire Torah. Okay, that is the entire Torah. Do not create entropy. Okay, and as we know, entropy is related to chaos, disorder, and sin. Okay, do not sin. Do not create entropy. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go learn. Okay, Hillel's statement makes perfect sense. And if you've ever wondered, how could Hillel say that this is the entire Torah? That's how. Because he knew at some level, doing things that are hateful and distasteful to other people creates entropy, chaos, disorder. and that is against the Torah. And so he knew he had the wisdom and the insight to say, this is the whole Torah. Okay? Absolutely brilliant. And so when we think about choosing life over death, okay, there's a few things that come up here. One is refraining from sin, not creating entropy. Another big emphasis of the Torah is improving your character traits, which is becoming more of an ordered person, reducing your own entropy. Pursuing righteousness helps society and you become more ordered. Pursuing justice helps society become ordered. Loving others, creating order in relationships. Okay? All of these things are related to entropy or the lowering of entropy. Okay? So choosing life over death involves reducing entropy and not putting energy into things that create chaos. Okay? Now, interestingly, the final thing I'm going to talk about is God's commandment to Abraham to go to yourself. Lech lecha. Okay, and we find this in Genesis 12, verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, go forth from your land and from your birthplace and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Now, the words here are lech lecha, which literally mean go to yourself. Okay? And when you read Jewish literature on these words, it talks about become more of yourself. Become more of yourself. Okay? And it's like, what does that mean? Okay? Returning to the physics of life, decreasing local entropy. Okay? Becoming more yourself means to become more ordered, more whole. Okay? Less chaotic internally. And we also find this in the works of Abraham Maslow, who talks about self-actualization. Okay? And essentially self-actualization is becoming fully human, everything that a person can be. Okay? And so it seems to me, when we review the Satan and entropy and social entropy and not doing what is hateful to your neighbor and all of these things, it really does seem to come down to a single unifying principle, which is behaving in an ordered way according to the commandments and not creating entropy for yourself or others by sinning and behaving in a disordered way. Okay? Not creating chaos in God's universe. Okay? And so the final thing I'm gonna wrap this up with is a quote from Deuteronomy, which I think is very, very instructive. Okay, so in Deuteronomy chapter 30, Moses says to the nation of Israel, behold, I have set before you today life and good, and death and evil, insomuch as I command you this day to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to observe his commandments, his statutes, and his ordinances, so that you will live and increase. Okay, these verses encompass everything that I've talked about in this video. Life and good are related. Death and evil are related. Okay, chaos, disorder, entropy. It's related. Okay, life and good and order, death and evil and disorder. Okay, and if you love the Lord your God and walk in his ways, observe his commandments, statutes, and ordinances, you will live and increase. Okay, you will increase, which is lech lecha. Okay, these verses encompass everything that we've talked about. And it can all be understood under the unifying principle of chaos order. Okay? So, yeah, that's what I had to share. When it comes to this idea of God being a living God, what we're really looking at is the pursuit of order. Okay? We are looking at the pursuit of order. Okay? Order and harmony. Okay, creating a harmonious and ordered world, okay, which we're commanded to do. Adam was commanded to do that, but also a harmonious and ordered self. okay, which is lech lecha, go to yourself, okay? And so when we say that God is a living God, really what we're looking at here is what life is, right? It's the creation of order. It's the ordering of, you know, matter and spirit and everything into something that is whole, undivisible, and yeah, ordered, okay? Organized, you know? And when we think about God as a living God, this all kind like it kind of makes sense to me, and maybe I'm not explaining it very well. But God is not chaotic. Okay? God is not disordered. Okay? God is the ultimate order. Okay? God is the ultimate harmony. Okay? And when God is a living God, that's partially what we're saying. Okay? Like, yes, on some level, we refer to God as a living God because the idols that people worship are dead things like trees or statues. Like, they aren't living, okay? Like, statues are not living, you know? Like, an obelisk is not living. And if people bow down to those that worship those, they're worshiping a dead God, okay? And God is not that. But at a deeper level, living God seems to be a reference to the process of life as it manifests in our world, which is the pursuit of order, okay? And the resistance of chaos and so on. And that seems to be, you know, this deeper insight, which seems to be related to everything in the Torah, okay? All of the commandments that we're commanded to follow, like do not murder, do not steal, you know, all of these interpersonal commandments, they are designed to make society more harmonious and more ordered. Okay? And even some of the commandments that don't initially make sense, like, you know, Jews are commanded to keep kosher, Jews are commanded to shake the lulav, okay, and keep Shabbat and so on. I'm fairly certain that when Jews specifically keep those commandments, okay, like the lulav and kosher, they are increasing the spiritual order, okay, which is invisible to us, okay? So, you know, if a Jew doesn't keep kosher or whatever, it's creating spiritual disharmony, okay? It's creating spiritual chaos. And, you know, when a Jew shakes the lulav and follows the commandments and everything, they're creating spiritual order, okay, which we refer to as tikkun olam. But, you know, for the rest of us, non-Jews like myself, refraining from murder, refraining from stealing, refraining from negative speech about other people, lashon hara, okay, refraining from all of these kinds of things, creating justice, okay, pursuing justice. All of these things create interpersonal order, okay? They create social harmony. They create a more ordered world. And rectifying your character traits, okay? Becoming more disciplined, becoming more kind, becoming more patient, okay? All of these character traits that we can work on create a more ordered self, okay? And you know, we're commanded to do those things as well. So yeah, those are my thoughts on what it might mean when we talk about God as a living God. And you know, when it comes to the Torah as a tree of life, okay, one of the meanings there is that the commandments that the Torah gives us are the things that allow us to pursue order, to resist entropy, to resist sin. The Torah is a tree of life. It's a tree of order and becoming more ordered, okay? Which is, you know, why we refer to it as a tree of life for those who grasp it, okay? So yeah, those were my thoughts. Hope you enjoyed this, and you know, if you liked this, I've got more videos like this on my channel on a number of different topics. Um, you know, I talk a lot about thermodynamics. I have a little bit about quantum physics on my channel, but this video in particular, and a couple of my other videos on thermodynamics, really highlight how simple the Torah is from the perspective of physics. It all comes down to the Gibbs free energy equation, okay, and the choice between order and chaos. That's what it all comes down to. Okay, either you're settling the world that God gave us, or you are unsettling it. Okay, and that's kind of what everything comes down to. So thank you very much, and God bless.